As war raged in Europe during the early 1940s, the United States remained isolated from the violence. They watched as the European world tore itself apart, but that all changed on December 7th of 1941 when Japanese bombers struck American military installations in the Pacific. Thousands of servicemen and civilians lost their lives, and the United States could no longer remain out of the fray. By 1943, the American military was engaged in an island-hopping campaign, which involved capturing strategic islands in the Pacific Ocean and gradually moving closer to Japan itself. This campaign represented an aggressive offense on the part of the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor had galvanized Americans, and they were determined to take the fight to the Japanese. Salamua was a small town located on the northeastern coastline of Papua New Guinea. Specifically, the town was situated on an isthmus with mountains on the inland side. Before the war, it was developed as a hub for coastal shipping and supporting a nearby gold mining operation. On January 21st of 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked the town and the Australian residents evacuated as a result. On March 8th, the Imperial Japanese Army landed their 144th Infantry Regiment at Salamua. The few local volunteers who were still stationed at the town fled into the wilderness and began spying on the Japanese forces. The infantry regiment established Salamua as a military base. 2 days later, the American Navy attacked Japanese ships nearby, and Salamua became a target of the Allied forces for the next year and a half. On June 28th of 1942, 450 members of the Australian Army 25th Independent Company Commandos raided Salamua. They killed 120 Japanese soldiers and captured some equipment and documents. However, the town was still firmly in the hands of the Japanese. Fast forward to March 26th of 1943, when an American aircraft took flight from Dobodura airfield in New Guinea. The plane was piloted by Captain Donald Good, the gunner was Sergeant Joseph Fox, and their photographer was Private William Ramsey. They were assigned to the 5th Air Force, 3rd Bombardment Group, 89th Bombardment Squadron. They were going on a strike mission to Salamua. However, while attacking the town, their right side engine was struck by anti-aircraft fire. The engine became engulfed in flames, and the heat quickly became too intense. Sergeant Fox and Private Ramsey bailed out of the plane and dropped into the ocean approximately 2 miles out from shore. Captain Good remained in the aircraft and managed to fly it south, where he deployed a life raft and ditched the plane. Captain Good reached the shore and was helped by a missionary, and he was later transported back to the American base on a barge. Sergeant Fox also reached the shore, but he wasn't as lucky as Captain Good. He was captured by Japanese forces and became a prisoner of war. His fate remained unknown until September of 1943, when Allied forces reviewed a Japanese officer's diary. The translation of this diary revealed that Sergeant Fox had been taken to the 7th Naval Base Force, where he was interrogated and later executed via beheading with a sword. As far as anyone knows, Private Ramsey never made it to shore and he was never seen again. He most likely drowned or died in some other way. He remains listed as missing in action to this day. Private Ramsey was declared dead on December 17th of 1945, and he earned the Purple Heart. Sergeant Fox earned both the Air Medal and the Purple Heart. Captain Good continued to serve in the military, including the Korean War, and he earned the Silver Star, as well as the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster. He eventually retired with the rank of Colonel. I included this case in the video because, although it's not much of a mystery, it contains both an MIA and a POW. It's difficult to imagine what those men must have gone through on that fateful day in the Pacific. On June 25th of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, and thus began the Korean War. North Korea was backed by the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, while South Korea was backed by the United Nations Command, led by the United States. The Korean War was the first proxy war in the Cold War. According to the first official consensus in 1949, the North Korean population was a total of 9.6 million, and their military forces numbered between 150,000 to 200,000. The South Korean population was a total of 20 million, which might make you expect that they had a larger and better military than North Korea, but they were actually unprepared at the time. As of June 1950, their military numbered 98,000 soldiers, and they had no tanks and only 22 planes in their air force. The United States had denied their requests for tanks, and they only positioned between 200 and 300 troops on the Korean peninsula. Wayne Johnny Johnson was from San Marcos, Texas, and he was only 18 years old at the time. I want to stress this point. Johnny was younger than I am right now, and he entered a war in a foreign country. I can't even imagine what that would be like. The nerves and fear must have been insane. He entered the 21st Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division of the United States Army. From July 5th to July 13th of 1950, the 24th Infantry Division conducted a series of operations between Pyeongtaek and Chochiwon in South Korea that were designed to delay the flow of incoming enemy forces. On July 11th, North Korean forces attacked the 1st Battalion's defensive position and command post. The attack was very effective, disorganizing the battalion and cutting off their communications. The battalion fought valiantly, but they were overrun after several hours. At the end of this battle, Johnny and many of his brothers-in-arms were taken captive by the North Koreans. Johnny was marched to various temporary holding points in Seoul, South Korea, then Pyongyang in North Korea, and then Manpo, North Korea. From Manpo, Johnny and the other prisoners of war began what's known as the Tiger March. A North Korean major who was known as the Tiger was taking command of 700 prisoners, and Johnny happened to be one of them. The Tiger March was headed to remote camps called Apex camps farther up the Yalu River in North Korea. The Tiger March is also sometimes known as the Tiger Death March because of its casualties. They lost a man for every mile of the march, which was nearly 100 miles long. Against the wishes of his captors, Johnny secretly kept a list of his fellow prisoners who perished during their captivity. In tiny handwriting, Johnny recorded the names of every single man who had died. Most of the deceased were soldiers, but there were also civilians, a few nuns, and a young Korean boy the soldiers called Johnny. The soldier Johnny stated that, "I just felt like someone would want to know when these people had died." Johnny risked his own life for the sake of making his list. The punishment for recording the list could easily have been execution. His friends brought him the names while fellow soldiers stood guard, making sure he didn't get caught. Out of the 700 prisoners, only 262 survived. Johnny's list contains 496 names. He was released in August of 1953 after spending 3 years in captivity. He handed over the list to the Department of Defense, which was greatly helpful to their effort in identifying soldiers. Somehow, Johnny's efforts went unrewarded until 1995, when the Defense Prisoner of War and Missing Personnel Office reviewed his records and found a recommendation for Johnny's recognition. In 1996, Private Wayne Johnson was awarded the Silver Star. The list remains as a chilling reminder of those men who perished during 4 summers and 3 brutal winters in captivity. They froze, starved, and were executed. It must have taken a lot of courage for Johnny, a teenager, to disobey his captors by making a record of his fallen brothers. In 1962, the United States increased their involvement in the Vietnam War, and the North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh visited China. He told the Chinese leadership that the United States might attack North Vietnam, and China offered to send 230 battalions into the war. At this time, a civil war was also raging in Laos. This was not just a domestic affair, but directly and indirectly involved both the United States and the Vietnamese. Starting in 1961, American forces began trading among tribesmen in Laos for the purpose of disrupting North Vietnamese supply routes. One such effort was known as Operation White Star. This operation involved training and advising various groups in unconventional warfare tactics, as well as staffing Laotian military schools. On July 14th of 1962, a civilian aircraft took off from Vientiane, Laos, and it headed for Saravane, Laos. They also had a scheduled stop in Pak Sa, Laos. The personnel aboard the aircraft included the civilian pilot Alan Blewett, a Thai interpreter whose name I could not find, and Staff Sergeant Raymond Francis Parks. Sergeant Parks served with the 7th Special Forces Group and participated in the White Star operation. The plane failed to arrive at Pak Sa, and a communications check was initiated, but no trace of the plane was ever found, nor were the passengers. Sergeant Parks had joined the military from Ohio, and he is now memorialized on the corpse of the missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. Blewett and Sergeant Parks were among almost 600 Americans who disappeared in Laos during the Vietnam War. It has been theorized that Blewett and Sergeant Parks joined the ranks of prisoners in Laos, but it is not known for certain. If this theory is true, then Blewett and Sergeant Parks were likely picked up by the communist Pathet Lao. Only 2 Americans were able to escape from the Pathet Lao during the Vietnam War. One was Navy Lieutenant Charles Klussman, whose aircraft had been shot down over the Plain of Jars in Laos on June 6 of 1964. For some reason, I could not find information about the other American who was recovered. At any rate, the public was demanding an end to the fighting in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam and Laos, but nobody had informed Congress that there were prisoners of war in Laos who had not yet been released, and their fate was unknown. However, we do have some clues as to what happened to prisoners of war following the end of the conflict. On October 11th of 1969, drones captured overhead photographs of Ban Na Khe Thieu in Laos. These photos revealed 20 non-Asians accompanied by Pathet Lao guards near caves at Ban Na Khe Thieu. The CIA determined that these prisoners were Caucasian, and previous reports indicated that they were most likely Americans. In 1971, the American Secretary of Defense sent a military general to Laos in order to offer military intelligence assets for the purpose of gathering information about prisoners of war. The American ambassador at the embassy in Laos rejected this offer and stated that the embassy could handle the return of POWs. On March 19th of 1973, Richard Nixon was informed that the U.S. Embassy in Vientiane has been told by the Pathet Lao that the U.S. prisoners of war in Laos will be released by the Lao communists in Laos and not by the Vietnamese in Hanoi. Just 3 days later, the American ambassador told the Secretary of State that he believed the Lao communists were holding more prisoners than they were letting on, and that they could not expect them to be open about that information. This suspicion was confirmed based on the number of Americans who had entered Laos and never returned. The United States halted its troop withdrawal due to the Pathet Lao not being honest about their POWs, but the response from the Lao communists was that the United States must bear full responsibility for any delay in return of POWs. Richard Nixon ordered the troop withdrawal to resume. 9 Americans and 1 Canadian were released in Hanoi on March 28th of 1973. The withdrawal of American troops was completed that same day. The American ambassador had been adamant that the Pathet Lao were not telling the truth about their POWs, but for some reason he ended up changing his tune by accepting that the 10 men who were released in Hanoi were all the prisoners. Unfortunately, despite the fact that the CIA knew about many more POWs being held in Laotian camps, the United States was unable to identify specific American individuals, so the leadership accepted that they would only ever recover 10 prisoners. Congress cut off funding for further action in Southeast Asia, and just like that, the POWs were on their own. On March 29th of 1973, Richard Nixon stated that all of our POWs are on their way home. Despite the fact that this was inaccurate, no further efforts were ever made to recover everyone else. The fate of the remaining prisoners of war remains unclear to this day, but I think it's safe to assume they perished in captivity. This is almost always how war is conducted. The leadership make decisions based on their own self-interest, and the people lower down the totem pole end up paying the price. On August 2nd of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Within 2 days, Kuwait was fully captured and occupied by Iraqi forces. This immediately resulted in the United Nations Security Council demanding that Hussein remove his troops from Kuwait, as well as the imposition of sanctions on Iraq. On August 7th, Operation Desert Shield began when the British and the United States both deployed troops and equipment to Saudi Arabia, and numerous other countries also joined the effort. Behind the United States and Britain, Saudi Arabia and Egypt contributed the most to the military alliance. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17th of 1991 when aerial and naval bombardments of Iraq began in an effort to dislodge Hussein's forces from Kuwait. During these early phases of the conflict, Trey Wilborn joined in the effort. Wilborn was from Huntsville, Alabama, and his mother described him as thoughtful, compassionate, caring, just a very good son. Wilborn enjoyed hunting in the Appalachian foothills, and he played football in high school, participating on both the offensive and defensive teams. His dream was to become an aviator in the United States Marine Corps, but his mother was always very worried about the dangers that such a profession would involve. Nonetheless, she supported her son in his ambitions. Wilborn attended Auburn University and completed the ROTC program, earning a degree in aviation management. After graduation, he went to the Marine Corps and completed Technical Basic School at Quantico, then attended Marine Flight School. During the conflict in the Middle East, Wilborn flew a total of 38 aerial missions, which comes out to an average of 2 or 3 missions per day. While overseas, Wilborn wrote to his parents and sister regularly, and he often signed his letters, Love, Trey, Pilot, Patriot, and Defender of Freedom. In one of these letters, Wilborn admitted, Mom, I don't like dropping bombs on people. He was a skilled pilot and a loyal soldier, but that didn't mean he enjoyed taking lives. He was sensitive to the effect that his missions had on others, and he always performed his duties with the hope that it would help people to live more freely and without fear of foreign invasion. On February 23rd of 1991, Wilborn was piloting an aircraft during a nighttime attack when he was shot down over central Kuwait. During the early weeks of the conflict, there was extensive media coverage of the servicemen and women who were killed or captured. When prisoners of war were forced in front of Iraqi cameras to advocate for an end to the violence, people at home would know that their loved ones were at least still alive, even if they were in captivity. However, it did not take long for the information gap to begin. The information gap was the effect of a decision by the Pentagon to cease the flow of information about prisoners of war. Instead of being open about those who were captured, they only released basic information, such as names, rank, age, and the branch of the military the person had served in. They justified this decision by claiming that it would avoid putting prisoners at risk. Wilborn's name popped up in the list of missing/POW servicemen in March of 1991, but no other information was released. That same month, 21 American prisoners of war were released by the Iraqis, but Wilborn was not among them. He was declared dead later that month, but his true fate is still unknown. Odds are that he either died when his plane crashed, or he was captured by Iraqi forces and held as a prisoner of war for an unknown amount of time. It seems highly unlikely that we will ever know Wilborn's fate for certain, but we can always hope otherwise. Click the join button to become a member today. Channel members receive exclusive content as well as early access to all my content. In response to the attacks on September 11th of 2001, an American-led coalition invaded Iraq and initiated a shock and awe bombing campaign on March 20th of 2003. This invasion toppled Saddam Hussein's regime and he was executed in 2006. However, the power vacuum that this caused led to even more violence in the region. On April 5th of 2004, a Shia Muslim cleric named Muqtada al-Sadr called for a jihad, or holy war, against the American-led coalition. Al-Sadr's militia took action, cutting off traffic into the Sunni Triangle in Iraq. The plan was to deplete the 1st Cavalry Division's stock of fuel and ammunition, leaving them defenseless and unable to move their equipment. As a result of these actions, the 724th Transportation Company was tasked with hauling fuel to the north gate of the Baghdad airport from a military camp 60 miles away. This effort would be made over the course of several days, starting on April 5th. What the company did not know was that the 1st Cavalry Division had pushed enemy forces into the suburbs of Abu Ghraib, which was directly along their route. On the first day of the mass transportation, a convoy of 5 armed vehicles and 17 fuel trucks with 2 tractors rolled directly into an ambush. This included a mixture of improvised explosives, RPGs, and firearms. The convoy commander was severely wounded and his driver was forced to take charge, leading the convoy out of the slaughter and into safety. 12 soldiers and 4 drivers were wounded, 5 civilian contractors and 1 soldier were killed, and 3 civilian contractors and 2 soldiers went missing. One of those missing soldiers was 24-year-old Army Staff Sergeant Keith Maupin, who was originally from Batavia, Ohio. 1 week after Sergeant Maupin's disappearance, the Arab television network Al Jazeera aired footage of the missing soldiers sitting on the floor surrounded by 5 masked men holding assault rifles. Later that year, in June, Al Jazeera showed another tape, this time of a prisoner being executed. It was unclear whether or not the second tape was Sergeant Maupin, given that the footage did not show the man's face, but it seemed very likely that he was deceased. In March of 2008, a tip from an Iraqi local led American troops to a set of human remains in an agricultural region north of Baghdad. They were recovered and examined, and they belonged to Sergeant Maupin. It's difficult to think about what his life was like at the end, and I hope his family and friends were able to get some closure.